welcome to the explainer. There's a set of laws that touches millions of lives every single day, and that's Brazilian labor law. We're going to dive into its incredible story today. And to really get where we are now, we have to go way back to a pretty brutal beginning. So let's start with something that might shock you. The word work itself. Its origin is, well, it's pretty dark. It comes from trapellium, which was literally a Roman instrument of torture. And that's not just some weird piece of trivia. It tells you everything. From most of history, work wasn't seen as a collaboration. It was punishment. And it's that harsh reality that eventually forced us to invent the very idea of labor rights. Now, for this whole explainer, we're drawing from the incredible work of a top expert, Professor José Cairo, Júnior. And just so you know, all the commentary we're sharing is updated right through August 2025. So we're not just going to read you the legal code. No. We're going to get into the why, the big ideas that brought these laws to life in the first place. Okay, first up, the brutal origins of work. To really get why labor law is such a big deal, we have to picture a world without it. We need to understand the problem, the huge societal problem that this law was born to fix. For a long time, work wasn't always this massive conflict. If you look at the Middle Ages, you had guilds where, for the most part, masters and their apprentices were kind of on the same team. But then, boom, the Industrial Revolution changes everything. It shatters that old model and creates this brand new fundamental conflict. On one side, you have capital, the factory owners. On the other, labor, the workers. And the tension between them, it just exploded into this massive crisis that people started calling the social question. So, what was the thinking back then? The prevailing idea, the philosophy of the state, was basically hands-off. It was all about freedom of contract. The government's view was, hey, we shouldn't get involved in private deals. And, on paper, that sounds perfectly fair, right? Totally equal. But the reality? It was anything but equal. The ideal, this Latin phrase, pacta sunt servanda, which just means agreements must be kept. Well, it only works if both sides have equal power. In reality, you had a huge supply of desperate workers, and they were treated just like any other raw material, a commodity. So this so-called freedom actually led to some pretty subhuman conditions. Child labor, crazy long hours. It was a disaster. So you can see, this wasn't just some small economic problem. It was a full-blown societal crisis. This huge, unbridgeable gap between the powerful and the powerless, that's what became known as the social question. The whole system was teetering on the brink. All right, so how do you fix a problem like that? Society came up with a pretty radical solution, a new type of law. One that wasn't designed to be neutral, but was built from the ground up to do one thing: protect. And that's where labor law, or direito do trabalho, comes in. Its main job isn't just to enforce contracts. It's to manage that deep-seated conflict between capital and labor. And why? To maintain social peace. It's really the first area of law to look at this conflict, admit, yep, this is real, and then actually try to do something about it. And to get to that social peace, the law does something that was absolutely revolutionary at the time. It picks a side. It intentionally says, we're here to protect the worker, because it formally recognizes that, in this relationship, the worker is the one who's vulnerable. In fact, the law has a specific legal term for this: hipossuficiencia. And this isn't just a fancy way of saying someone is poor. It's a legal concept. It's the presumption that the employee is at a disadvantage, not just economically, but also technically and especially legally when they're sitting across the table from an employer. This single idea, it's the cornerstone of everything else in labor law. So here's the absolute key takeaway. The law, on purpose, deliberately creates a legal inequality. And it does that to compensate for the factual inequality that already exists out there in the real world. This is the central logic, the beating heart of labor law. It tilts the scales on purpose. And the goal isn't to be unfair to the employer, not at all. It's to create real, meaningful balance by giving the worker a leg up. Okay, so this whole new way of thinking, this protective philosophy, It was just too radical. It couldn't just be a subchapter in some other legal textbook. No way. It had to become its own thing, declare its independence, and carve out its own territory. See, labor law actually started as part of civil law, which is the law that handles most private contracts. But they had a major fundamental disagreement. Civil law's whole foundation is the autonomy of private will, the idea that two people should be free to agree to whatever they want. But labor law says, whoa, hang on. There are some things a worker simply cannot agree to because the power imbalance makes that agreement inherently unfair and harmful. Philosophically, they were just worlds apart. So labor law had to break away. And this Declaration of Independence happened in 4 big steps. First, it needed its own unique principles, all based on protection. Second, it needed its own laws, like Brazil's famous CLT. Third, it needed its own special courts, the labor justice system. And finally, it had to be recognized as its own field of study in universities. Once all 4 of those were in place, bam, it was a fully independent branch of law. All right, now let's bring the story home. How did all of this unfold specifically in Brazil? Because its journey is really unique and fascinating. What's interesting is that in Europe, a lot of labor rights were won from the bottom up through massive strikes and powerful worker movements. Brazil's story is different. It was largely a top-down affair. It was really kicked off by President Getúlio Vargas back in the 30s, who kind of got ahead of social movements with his own populist labor laws. That whole process eventually gave us the famous CLT in 1943. And it all culminated in the super protective constitution we have today from 1988. And that CLT, the Consolidation of Labor Laws from 1943, was a true watershed moment. I mean, it took all these scattered laws and rules that were floating around and taking some inspiration from models like Italy's Carta del Lavoro, it packed them all into a single, cohesive body of law. For the very first time, Brazilian labor law had a real solid structure. And then, in 1988, came the Citizens' Constitution. And this document didn't just tip its hat to labor rights, it carved them in stone. Just look at Article 7. It's this incredible list of guaranteed rights: protection from being fired without cause, unemployment insurance, the 13th month's salary, an 8-hour workday, paid vacation, the whole shebang. This is the absolute bedrock of the system today. But as we all know, the world of work is always changing, right? It never stops. And so that old core principle of protection is now up against a whole new wave of 21st century challenges. So what's next for work? Well, one of the first big changes we've seen is the law trying to expand its reach. Thanks to a constitutional amendment back in 2004, labor courts in Brazil now have the power to look at all kinds of work relationships, not just the traditional 9-to-5 employee. This is a massive deal because it opens the door to regulating all the new ways people are working today. Now, this is where things get really interesting, especially with recent changes. The 2017 labor reform introduced a really fascinating and maybe controversial new idea. It created a split. On one hand, you still have the classic hipossuficiente worker, the vulnerable one who needs protection. But on the other hand, it created this new category, the hypersuficiente worker, the hyper-sufficient one. The thinking here is that if you're a high-income, highly educated employee, maybe you don't need the state protecting you so much. Maybe you should have more freedom to negotiate your own contract. And all of this leaves us with a huge, critical question for the future. In an age of gig work, AI, and automation, where the very nature of work is transforming before our eyes, who is the vulnerable worker of tomorrow, and what kind of protection will they actually need? The one thing we know for sure is that this story, it's far from over.